This review is brought to you in part by Ryder's Hobby Shops, where the fun begins. Stop in to one of Ryder's 2 convenient Michigan locations where you'll find a full range of the latest hobby products, supplies, parts, tools, and paint. This review covers the Nakajima Ki43 Kayabusa. It's codenamed Oscar by the Allies, in 1/48 scale by Arii models, and it's kit number A322-800. The Oscar was first flown in 1939 and accepted into service in October of 41. It was a radial engine fighter. It was light and easy to fly and became legendary for its combat performance. It could outmaneuver almost any opponent, but initially it lacked armor and self-sealing fuel tanks, and its armament was poor until its final version, or nearly 6,000 were produced through World War II. First released by Otaki in 1973, this kit features recessed panel lines, and in 1985 it was reboxed by Arii, and this is the edition that we're building here. But it's still marketed as the Micro Ace brand kit, and now it still has about 40 pieces molded in light gray and clear, and the only issue really with the kits is that the decals tend to be dried out or cracked and are quite often useless. But with the aid of some aftermarket decals and a few resin parts, you can make a pretty presentable model from this kit. And here are the contents of the kit. And as you see when you look at the pieces, there's some light flash on some of the parts, but this is quite an old mold, so there's a little bit of wear there. And now it's still nicely detailed, at least for the exterior parts. The cockpit is a little lacking in detail, but overall not a bad kit, and usually quite reasonably priced. Now the instructions just come on a two-sided page, and those are at the back end of this review if you need to refer to them. And it's also going to sport some mold and seam lines, but most of the parts fit together very well. And here you see the original decals for the kit. The markings are minimal, but unfortunately it had micro cracks, and as soon as those hit the water they pretty much disperse and fall apart. So I got some aftermarket decals, and I used those, and as you can see they're much whiter and much more clean, and we're going to use those instead. I'll also be using a set of wheel set resin parts from True Details, and they were a nice improvement over the kit's wheels, so I decided to use those too. Construction begins with the cockpit, and the kit's contents for that consist of 6 parts, with the seat, the base, and the floor, instrument panel, control stick, and the bulkhead and pilot. Now, all the cockpit parts were painted Japanese interior green. I used Tamiya XF71, and the pilot was given a base coat of gray to highlight any of the seams that might need to be cleaned up. Now, there's no decal for the instrument dials, so I just used a toothpick and a drop of paint in those in black, red, and yellow to give it some highlight. And once they were dry, I added a drop of future floor polish to give it a lens look. I see on the pilot figure here there's an opening in the back, and that corresponds to a block that it fits into on the seat. And I had to pare down that block a little bit and open this up just a bit in order to get the pilot to sit in the cockpit seat. And while I was painting the cockpit parts with the green, I also used that to paint the interior of the fuselage in the cockpit area. And when I did that, I also detailed that with a few details with some black, red, silver, yellow, just to give it some interest. You can also see up there towards the opening of the cockpit, there's a large ejector pin mark there. And you could clean that up, but with the pilot installed, it's pretty difficult to see it anyway. The control stick was painted interior green with a red-brown leather boot and a black grip. And the pilot's flight suit and helmet were painted red-brown. That's Tamiya XF64. The boots, Model Master, military brown, and the life vest I used Vallejo model color flat green, that's 70968. The scarf and lining of the flight jacket were painted flat white. And after it was taken, I painted the goggles black and the interior of the lenses light brown, and added a little future to make it look like lenses for his glasses. So after the paint's dried, assembly is pretty straightforward. Go ahead and put those together, and then assemble this into the fuselage halves and enclose it by gluing the halves together. And as you see, the wings are made up of 3 pieces, a single lower wing and 2 upper wing halves, and they were glued together. They fit together well, and they're easily filled seams, and then the fuselage can be added. Just place that into position. And I used a small bit of filler needed along the wing leading edge where it joined the fuselage, and then some perfect plastic putty and a bit of sanding took care of that. Now, as can be seen in the photo, the seam line between upper and lower wings was almost non-existent. And now take out the parts for the engine. There's 4 pieces, 2 cylinder blocks for the Saki 14-cylinder radial engine, and 1 piece representing the push rods and 1 for the prop mounting. Now the cylinders were painted aluminum. I used Tamiya X11. The crankcase was Tamiya LP13, and the push rods were a gloss black X1. Once the engine was finished, I attached it to the fuselage with the cowl flaps and the cowl. There were no fit issues at all there, and when I was happy with the wing seam and lines, the horizontal stabilizers were added, and the entire fuselage was given a coat of Model Master Aluminum 1781. Well, once the aluminum had cured, I masked and painted the yellow ID band along the leading edge of the wing, and I used thin stripes of low-tack painter's tape to outline the ID band there, and I used the same method to outline the anti-glare flat black area along the top of the fuselage. And once these were dry, I again used some strips of tape to outline the movable surfaces on the wing and the horizontal tail surfaces. And I'd seen pictures of these painted a light green, so aluminum, dope, or even light gray, and I decided to make mine the light greenish gray color. While the fuselage was being set up, I decided to tackle the prop, and it has a single yellow warning band near the tip. And I first painted the prop and spinner a dark brown, kind of a propeller color, and that comes from painting instructions from Hasegawa's kit. And the paint is Mr. Color prop color number C131. Once the paint's cured, I applied a piece of tape to mask the tip of the prop, and then apply a thin strip of tape next to the first one. And once those were in place, I masked the rest of the prop blade off. Then I removed the thin strip in the middle of the masking and sprayed that yellow. And once the yellow was dried, all the masking can then be removed. And here's those aftermarket parts I mentioned. It's a set of resin wheels from True Details, and they look much better than the 2-part kit wheels, although you could use those just as well, but you have to clean up the seam. Now, I cut them from the casting blocks using a fine toothed razor saw. And whenever you're cutting or sanding resin, you should not breathe in the dust. And one way to do that is to keep the part wet all the time. I usually keep a bowl of water nearby to keep rinsing the part. You could also, of course, wear a good quality mask. Now, I did take the time to fill and sand smooth the 2 ejector pin marks on the inside of each landing gear bay door. I painted the tires Tamiya rubber black, that's XF85. The wheel hubs, struts, and the landing gear doors were painted aluminum, and a thin yellow line was added to the front side of each landing gear door exterior to match up with the yellow ID band on the underside of the wings. With the landing gear painted and the aluminum dry on the plane, I sprayed 2 thin coats of Future over the fuselage. Then I brush painted the dark green model camouflage using some Tamiya XF13. I didn't follow the pattern in the Aero Master guide. I just did a random one, just like a field applied would be, and I left it a little bit light in areas because out in the field sometimes the pattern is probably has some variation to it and is somewhat haphazard. Now this paint session lasted a while, but it's a lot of fun and I was happy with the results. And after the green had time to dry, I coated it over once again with some Future and let that set to dry. Once the Future had cured, I applied some of the Hinamaru decals. Those are the large red circles, and on the upper wing surfaces, but they wrinkled very badly, from the setting solution. But I think what happened there was the Future wasn't quite dry. Maybe it was on too thick. So I let it dry thoroughly for a couple of days, and then I removed those with some painter's tape, just stripped those off. I applied another set of the Hinamaru decals, and they turned out to be very much better. They showed some signs of some of the remnants that I couldn't get off, but you have to be very close up to see those. Next, I masked the canopy with a set of Edward canopy masks, and they really make that an easy task compared to cutting all of the little strips. Now, by the way, the aftermarket decals detail this as the Ki43-2, so it's a second version. Now, I would really recommend these. They're very nice decals, and I chose option number 2 set and of Captain Nemai, and he actually survived the war. Now, it also notes that the placement of the oil cooler is further back under the engine cowl, and it's different than that on the Ki43-1. Well, there you have it. I made a pitot tube from some brass tubing, applied the canopy as you see here, and with the aftermarket decals and the weighted resin tires, this turns out to be a really nice looking representation of the craft, and if I were you, I'd buy one and put it on my shelf. Well, we hope you enjoyed this premium step-by-step model kit review, and so that you don't miss any more, please subscribe to our YouTube channel by clicking on the icon in the lower right of any of our reviews. You could also find us on Facebook or our website, rightonreplicas.com. Thanks.